centers. We're one of 6 in Clackamas County, and I'd like to introduce Shatrine Craig, the director of Wesleyan Chamber.
Hi, everybody. We're so excited to have you today with us, and we're so excited to hear Bill speak on behalf of this important topic. So just a little recap, if you're wondering, what in the world are the Clackamas County Business Resource Centers? Well, of course, we are a group that was put together during this COVID-19 pandemic. And we're a collaboration of 6 chambers, as Liz mentioned, who represent the voice of small businesses in our communities through advocacy, growth, and equity. During this time, this last year and almost a half, we've helped hundreds of businesses get answers, solve problems, and connect resources to navigate this ever-changing COVID-19 situation. So if you have any questions for us, please feel free. Our website is actually clackamasbusiness.org, or you could reach out to Liz or I, and we will try and help your business needs. But we thank you for being here today.
And one of the reasons we chose Bill de la Cruz is because we know that things are going to change in the coming year, and the way business is being done and all the different changes that are coming along made it appropriate to ask Bill to come talk to us about microaggressions and customer service and how microaggressions affect our employees and our customers. Bill has been instrumental over the last couple of years since he moved to Oregon to be part of the equity process of Lake Oswego through the Lake Oswego School District and the city of Lake Oswego. But he came to Oregon with a lot of nationwide experience, and it has only become more awareness than ever. So he's developed programs and workshops. He helps individuals and groups on self-awareness, enhancing relationships, and most of all, to foster positive, sustainable personal growth, because we kind of have to start with ourselves before we can start with others. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce Bill de la Cruz to talk to us today about customer service and microaggressions.
Thank you, Liz. It's very nice to be here. And Shatrine, I'm honored to be part of the first of anything. So I really like that we can do this together. And I have a lot of interesting things I want to share. So I think we'll have a great conversation. I just wanted to start with acknowledging the work that you all have decided to do to collaborate with each other. 6 or 7 chambers coming together to collectively work on a project is really says something about your commitment to the work, and also modeling that if we're going to move through this time that we're in, all of us, we're going to have to figure out how to work together, because no one person has the answer. So congratulations on that. I think that's it says a lot about moving from, well, let's compete with each other to let's figure out how to work together, because that's a really great strategy to use as you talk about advocacy and growth. So I'm going to just jump right in, because I'm going to get into a flow here, and we'll have a chance when we are close to being done to answer questions or anything that that might come up as you listen. So the way I'm going to ask you to listen is to just be open and to just not just hear what I'm sharing with you, but think about what it feels like or the emotion that you're having, because the way that culture looks today is it's really challenging when you think about the culture of even the word that we're talking about, microaggression. Aggression is a very deficit-based word, and it's about putting this thing out that might be ugly or that might be fearful, or how do I do that? And so what I'm going to share with you is, as Liz said, thinking about, number one, what does that word mean to me? And what emotion do I feel when I hear it? And then how willing am I, through that emotion and feeling, to actually hear how something I said might have offended somebody. I had a colleague at work one time, her name's Leslie, she's still my friend. And I was telling her about a house that I was buying, and I told her it had these really nice plantation shutters. Well, my friend Leslie's Black, And she said, we're going to talk in a little bit. And I knew I had done something because we had that kind of agreement. So she pulls me aside later and she says, Bill, like, you know, I'm Black, right? I said, yeah, Leslie, of course. So you know what the word plantation means to me. And as soon as she said it, I'm like, oh, absolutely. It's part of her history. It's part of her ancestry around slavery and ways that she's been impacted as a Black woman in America. And so when she told me that, I knew right away, and I could either defend or I could just accept. And so I chose to accept. And I just said, you know, that wasn't my intent. And yet the impact was that I hurt her, or I hurt her feelings, or I triggered something in her, whatever you want to say. And so by accepting it and then apologizing, it made me realize that if I'm not going to use that word with her, then I won't use it with anybody. So the next person I described my house to, I said, I have these really nice wood shutters. And so I'm telling you that story because these things that we're talking about, they're just things that hurt us. And if you think about ways that you've been treated based on however you define yourself, any identity, race, age, gender, there's so many ways that we identify ourselves, that some point there is some way that something you did affected somebody else and something that someone else did affected you. And so this idea of being aware, I would maybe reframe that and say awareness of the impacts of the hurt that we can cause to each other in the workplace, at home, in our social situations. So I'm going to continue to use the word because that's what we are talking about, is microaggressions. And I'm also going to challenge us all to figure out how to reframe that, because if you get triggered from the word microaggression, especially if somebody says to you, that was a microaggression, and you go right into defending or justifying, the chances of you having a really open conversation go down. So we're going to just look at some more examples. I'll share things with you in my own stories and some other things. And then we're going to reflect on the impact of them. If you think about culture and you think about the workplace today, I just read an article and I just saw something. Of course, if I read it, it was true, but it's one of a number of conversations about the workplace and how a lot of people don't want to or are fearful of going back to a workplace because of the culture that is so unknown. And so workplace culture is going to be a really strong driver for how people would choose something. With all the work being equal, if this was a more inclusive workplace, at least had a culture where we could challenge each other and hold each other accountable, I might choose that one over the one where I had the same professional responsibilities in an environment that maybe didn't feel the greatest. It's kind of those trade-offs that we do. And then how do we minimize them? I mean, in the short conversation, the way we minimize them is to become aware that we're doing them and stop, and more challenging than it might sound. And then just moving from awareness to action, because awareness without action will never change what we're doing or where we're going. And so the workplace culture is really interesting because even that word means different things to different people. And so we have to move out of these assumptions that when we say workplace culture, everyone knows what that means. Because in most of the organizations I work with across the country, workplace culture has nothing to do with how I feel. It has more to do about, or less to do about how I feel and more to do about how I get the work done. And so we have to start to balance that. It's called relational leadership. How do we create a culture that's relational, where we get to know each other? I worked with a couple of teachers years ago, and they had worked together for 5 years, and they thought they knew everything about each other. So we did a really quick activity called personal histories. And it's for 20 minutes, talk about where you grew up, what it was like, and what were some of your early values from that time. They came back and they were in shock because they realized that when they were kids, they lived 3 blocks from each other, and they went to the same summer camp, and they still have the same high school friends. They knew each other for 5 years and yet knew nothing about each other. And so it takes me into this next piece around assumptions. So when we're making an assumption, we are thinking about things in our brain. So that first question is, what's cognitively happening in our brain when we make an assumption? And what's happening is we are in a present day interaction with somebody, and then something triggers us. So it's called an emotional charge. We get triggered. And then we go back to another time in our lives that feels like this, because we know it's not exactly the same situation because it's a different person. And then we respond with all of that emotional charge. And basically what we're doing when we're making an assumption is we're making up a story about something that's happening here that we don't know that is actually true. And so we make a lot of assumptions when we're talking about these issues of how we hurt or how we do microaggressions or how we stereotype or how we judge, because a lot of what we do is driven by our assumptions, assuming that one person represents a whole group, or assuming that because they're dressed that way or they drive that kind of car that they shouldn't be in this neighborhood, or all of the things that we make assumptions. And partly what I want to tell you is that I share this with you through the lens of this is all my own work. So I'm right here doing the same work every day because it's about practice. It's not about perfection. So I have some theoretical pieces. Ultimately, though, I want to tell you that this is my own personal journey. And so all of this change that we want is possible if each of us does our own work. And when we think about, again, go back to that workplace culture, if it doesn't involve relational leadership, then we haven't learned anything. And so to me, that's not an assumption. It's just something that I have experienced and realized that there's a step that we need to do to move out of assumption. And that's to look at what's actually happening. And so again, it's being aware. So all of these things that I'm sharing with you, I've done and I still do. I just have more mechanisms internally that I've created that help me to calm myself down or come back and be present or let go of it. And it's not always easy because sometimes, darn it, I just want to be right. And so I have to then go back and take a really good look at myself. So regardless of how you define yourself, what your profession is, what you're doing, we all play roles in this work. And in this case today, I'm going to facilitate and provide content. I'm going to tell you stories. I'm going to share with you my own experiences. I'm going to challenge the status quo and I'm going to push and probe. And challenging the status quo is important to me because it just means that I want to stop doing things the way that we've always been doing them. Doesn't mean I want to push somebody off or denigrate anybody. It just means that the results that we want, we haven't been getting with what we've been doing. So to me, I just want to do something different. And for me, what I'm sharing with you is that something different. And I'm constantly challenging myself so I don't get complacent. And that's not always easy either. So push and probe, and I'm going to model behaviors. And what that means is if we were in person, I would do everything I'm going to ask you to do. Today, I am going to do everything because I'm just talking with you. But as you do your own work, think about this. What is your status quo that you can challenge? How do you push and probe yourself? How do you own the work? How do you stay engaged? How do you use your voice? And how do you build a team dynamic in your professional life, in your personal life? Because those still are the valid questions. And to really do this work, it's important to just be really conscious of when you're answering these questions. If you label something negative, that's just your narrative that's telling you what you're experiencing is wrong. And so a lot of this is even thinking about the mindset. So even the narrative of the word microaggressions or the narrative of the word bias. I do bias awareness work, and for most people, the word bias is attributed to a negative characteristic, somebody who's broken, who's hiding something, who is discriminatory, who's closed-minded, bigoted, and now realizing that every human being is biased because we're approaching the life through the lens of what we see. And so this idea of personal or of roles is really thinking about, what role are you playing right now in the culture that you are living in the culture that you're working in? And is there at any level an expectation that someone else is going to change the culture, or are you part of that? So building team dynamics is really key. And these personal agreements are just ways that we can agree to talk with each other when we're in these dialogues, because they're challenging. Awareness of judgment that leads to blame or shame, respect for use of electronics. That's more than when I was in person. What's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. That's about not sharing each other's stories. Accept and expect non-closure, experience discomfort, and speak your truth. So you could look at these as a set of agreements that you can take into any workplace culture and start to think about, what does that mean for the people who are there? The first one's really important, awareness of judgment that leads to blame or shame. Because when we are judging, we're no longer present with each other, because judgment lives up here in my head. So if I'm in a conversation with you and I start judging you, the moment that judgment comes out, they are such, or he is such, or whatever it is, I'm no longer present because judgment lives up here in my head. So I'm now interacting with you based on the story that I'm making up about you, and not necessarily about what's actually happening in front of me. And so judgments and assumptions, which I talked about earlier, play a role, because as we judge more and more, then we start to make these assumptions, and then we start to detail them even more to say, well, this is a characteristic of that kind of person. This is a characteristic. So it goes from this macro into this micro, and we start to look at individual characteristics and then move into blame and shame. And so the idea of judgment is that as I become more aware of my judgment, I have more strategies to be able to stop them and push them aside and come back and be present. So it's not that we stop doing these things, it's just understanding that the way that we interact with each other has an impact on how the interaction goes. And the other piece is, again, if you're going to have these conversations in the workplace, you need to have some agreements, because you need to have a framework that says, this is how we're going to talk, because these are not emotional-free conversations. And again, the workplace culture is designed from a professionally determined outcome. It's not designed from this relational piece. So we have to fundamentally shift the culture of what we do to say relationships matter. Even if you go 20/80, that's better than nothing. I've worked in schools across the country, and I would ask teachers, in the last 30 days, how much time have you all spent building relationships with each other? Just getting to know each other, not doing work, not having professional development. Across the country, it's 0 to 30 minutes. So we're asking teachers to do with our students and families what they have no time to do with each other, because of the way that we have driven education to have that academic background and outcome. Now we're seeing there's a need for the relational piece. So I'll keep saying that over and over again. This is really about being relational. So if you don't have a set of agreements, create one. You can use anything here, but really make some happen. So I'm going to share a quick video. Yes.
Good day, everyone. My name is Daryl Wingsu, and I am a professor of psychology and education at Teachers College, Columbia University. I am also author of Microaggressions in Everyday Life and Microaggressions and Marginality. Today, I would like to share with you some of the harmful impact that microaggressions have on marginalized groups in our society. But what are microaggressions? Well, microaggressions are the everyday slights, indignities, put-downs, and insults that people of color, women, LGBT populations, or those who are marginalized experience in their day-to-day interactions with people. Microaggressions oftentimes appear to be a compliment, but contain a meta-communication or a hidden insult to the target groups in which it is delivered. People who engage in microaggressions are ordinary folks who experience themselves as good, moral, decent individuals. Microaggressions occur because they are outside the level of conscious awareness of the perpetrator. In this scene, Michael, an Asian American graduate student, is receiving academic counseling from his sponsor. They have a pleasant conversation. At the end of their meeting, the advisor delivers what he believes to be a compliment to Michael by stating, quote, "You know you speak excellent English," end quote. Michael is disturbed because it seems to imply that he is not a true American and that he is a perpetual alien in his own country. Microaggressions can also be delivered non-verbally through unconscious behaviors or gestures. In this scene, Jenny has finished a late night at the office and awaits the elevator. As the door opens, she takes one step forward, sees a black male rider, hesitates, and immediately clutches her purse and places her hand over her necklace. The hidden communication is that African Americans are prone to crime, will break the law, are up to no good, and will steal. Gender microaggressions occur also frequently to women. In this scene, Laura, a female manager, sits with her male colleagues in a meeting with the president. Note that the men tend to talk to one another, cut her off in mid-sentence, and that the president addresses only the males in the group. When Laura attempts to contribute to the discussion, she is oftentimes ignored. In one case, a male colleague checks his phone rather than listen. What can each and every one of us do to combat microaggressions? We need to realize that microaggressions are unconscious manifestations of a worldview of inclusion, exclusion, superiority, inferiority. Thus, our major task is to make the invisible visible. There are, in essence, 5 things that we need to do individually. First, learn from constant vigilance of your own biases and fears. Second, experiential reality is important in interacting with people who differ from you in terms of race, culture, ethnicity. Thirdly, don't be defensive. Fourthly, be open to discussing your own attitudes and biases and how they might have hurt others or in some sense revealed bias on your part. Lastly, it is very important to be an ally. Stand personally against all forms of bias and discrimination. I wrote 2 books, Microaggressions in Everyday Life and Microaggressions and Marginality, to help us combat microaggressions at the individual, institutional, and societal level. If we are to become a fair, just, and humane society, I hope each and every one of you will join me in this important.
So regardless of what you experienced there, what you saw there, what you felt there, there was a lot in that video. And maybe you watched some of those things and said, oh, does that really happen? And maybe it was the extreme, and yet those things happen every day in the workplace. And so the awareness piece is really the key to beginning this whole process in terms of what do we need to do. And if you want to take a picture of this page, I think that's great. This is something that you could have a conversation with somebody after we're done here. Do you feel you've ever been judged? What was that judgment that someone made of you? And more importantly, how did it feel? See, we are more able, I think, to tell the description of the story of what happened versus going to how did it feel, because how does it feel means I have to be vulnerable. And so that's a little more challenging to do. And then, do you feel you judge others on account of their identity? And I would say yes to both questions. I remember when I was on the school board in Boulder, and I would do talks just like this. And mostly older white people would come up to me and they'd put their hand on my arm like this, and they'd bow their head and they would say, "You speak so well," in that tone of voice. And when I was really young, I didn't even think of it. I didn't know microaggression from anything. I just knew that it hurt my feelings and I got mad. And then as I continued to speak, and people would still say that, then I started to ask them, what did you expect? And it doesn't happen as often anymore. And when it does, I ask people, well, what was it that struck you, or what did you hear me talk about? And so a lot of this is thinking about how do you flex to make your culture, your workplace culture, a place where people can be themselves. So when you ask these questions, then you have to drop into your own personal story. And so I know I judge people because that's part of my socialization. I've been trained to think about people in certain ways, and that's part of my work, is how do I not allow that to drive how I interact with people from groups. It's not that I'm unaware of them, it's that I have a choice whether or not I want to treat you like that. It's why it's so challenging when we say, well, we want to diversify the workplace. And when we say that, we mostly mean by race. And yet we haven't had the conversation to say, why does our workplace not support someone who's different from being here? And then when we put somebody who's different in there, they don't last because we don't ever talk about how we're going to impact the culture. And that's where now I think over the next few years, people are going to be looking to places to work where they can at least feel some sense of inclusion or belonging. And so if we were doing this activity, I'd have you just write down a stereotype that you received, but I'll just have you think about it. And again, how did that feel? What narrative did it connect to about yourself or not? So basically what these things are everyday exchanges, and they damage how inclusion is perceived, they diminish the effectiveness or discourage applications. Most organizations across this country are having DEI policies and practices, and a majority of them are failing because they're just putting money into it and not really understanding that it's about the people. And so how do you just put your resources into impacting people? Because all of this is done through our mind, and we all have the ability to be more aware of how we're using language. I know I have very often, especially when I was younger, said something that had an impact I didn't want, and I would later ask myself, if you had 30 more seconds to think about that, would you have said it? And typically my answer is no, only I didn't take 30 seconds at the time. So I spent hours and days cleaning it up because it was with somebody that I cared about. So when you think about it, it's just the way that we treat each other. And I love to look at the research of things. So this is another research piece. So before the 1970s, we didn't even use the word microaggressions. It was this researcher's work who basically, that's how he described the insults and dismissals that he witnessed between mostly Black and white folks. And so I highlighted those words, insults and dismissals, because essentially what his research, Chester Pierce, is that these insults and dismissals for him were defined as marginalized groups, and now those marginalized groups have grown. And so if it's harder to think about what you're doing as a microaggression, think about it as an insult or a dismissal, because whatever narrative you carry is going to drive it. And I look at it as it wasn't the impact that I wanted to have, because what I found for myself, as soon as I label it, then I'm going to approach it differently. So as much as I can just recognize that what happened here was not what I intended, and yet I know I played a role. And then we have the other side. One thing I learned when I went to school is that it was so interesting to watch and read research, because you could find two sides of the coin for every topic. So here's other folks who have criticized the microaggression concept for its lack of scientific basis, over reliance on subjective evidence. So it's relying more on how we perceive what we're doing versus scientific evidence. And so, those are the extremes. And I think a lot of my role is to say, so those are the extremes, what's the middle look like? Because for every one of your workplaces, your organizations, your community groups, your churches, your HOAs, that's going to look different. Because the reason why I mention all those groups is what I'm sharing with you is transferable, because you take it with you. It's not something you do. Now I'm going to go to work, and now I'm going to be more aware of how I insult or don't insult somebody. And I say it that way because for me, that's how I had to get, that's what I had to get to be able to really understand what my work was. Because when I sugarcoated my behavior, it made it seem like it was okay. And so it wasn't that I beat myself up, it was that I realized that I hurt somebody or something I said. And this isn't just related to your out groups. One meeting on the school board, there was a Latino gentleman, Native American guy, he came up to the podium, and that community worked really hard to get me elected. And 2 years later, he stood up in front of me and called me a sellout and told me I was turning white because I was working with the district to try to make change. And I expected it in the community that I was in, that there would be folks who didn't look like me that had those feelings. I never expected to see somebody reflecting me, telling me those things. And so we do this to each other. And so it's just something, again, to think about. If you think about your own workplace culture, what are some of the things you've heard over the years that have just caused you to think, that didn't sound right? And then why didn't you do something about it? Well, that's what culture is. So when we're talking about culture, we have to think about what's the culture that will support these conversations. And this is an interesting piece. It's basically saying that when we avoid behaviors that we think are microaggressions, we actually, to me, this is my perspective. So since I'm talking with you, I'll share that, that ignoring them causes as much self-harm and impacts your freedom, and that asking an authority figure, so let's just go to the boss, means that I don't develop those skills. And so this idea of freedom is really important, because as human beings, we only have a certain amount of energy and a certain capacity to hold space, to hold anything. And when we feel emotionally harmed and we don't resolve it, it never goes away. And so we carry that emotional harm from job to job, relationship to relationship, place to place. It's my lesson I learned when I was young. I finally figured out that I can't run away from myself, that at a certain point I had to stop, turn around, take a look in the mirror, and just deal with whatever was there, regardless of how hard it was. And that was really hard. And I still am challenged by that, because to me, that's what we're talking about. We have to move away from this call out, this cancel, this person to person. That's the most effective way. And this is about creating some level of a healing process, because when everybody's life around the planet stopped in March of 2019, it disrupted everyone's normalcy and created some level of trauma for every single person on the planet. So we have this whole trauma place, and it's coming out in different ways. And without labeling it, I just think it's important to think about, how do you heal it? When you know that people coming to the workplace have personal lives, they have people affected by what's happening, and how do we create this culture where we can have that balance between being there and being a professional, and being there and being myself? That's the challenge. And so, how do we stop avoiding each other? Because there's no way we're going to avoid our way out of this conversation. It's never going to go away until we face it. And so that's why this is so important to me, because the reason I do this work is I want to make the world a more humane place. And so it's just important to understand that these aren't behaviors that bad people have. These are behaviors that everyday people have. These are behaviors that I've had, that I have. And I have to now just use that awareness to take action when something happens, because now I know that someone is being impacted by what's happening. So these are just some things around the microaggressions. So the first thing to do is to examine your own triggers. So again, when things are heard or said or done in the workplace and you get triggered, what does that mean to you? And how do you respond to that, whether you're the person who said the insult or dismissal, whether you're the person who received it, or whether you're the bystander who heard it. So these are some that I just wanted to share with you. The first one is part of my own story. You are so articulate. So what would you say instead? Well, you really don't have to say anything if that's what's in your head. And this is where I go to, if I'd have waited another 30 seconds, would I have asked that question? And so when I answer no, or even when I have to think about it, I wonder if I should ask this. That's usually an indicator to me that maybe I should lean to not. And then just commend people on ideas and insights. And that's where I finally got to, because the few people that interacted with me didn't flex, so I wanted to. So I actually asked them about, what did you hear? You're transgender. Wow, you don't look like it at all. What to do instead? Say nothing. That's one of those comments that is really nothing that should be shared or is respectful to be shared, or it's just, again, it all starts as a thought. And that's why I say, keep going back to the narrative and being self-aware, because as you become more aware of your thoughts, then the ability to discern whether this is something I should share or something I keep to myself can grow, because you're more aware of what's happening in your present moment. Oh, sorry, wrong person. I had that happen when we were two Latino guys in Boulder who both got elected, him to the city council and Rich Lopez to the city council and myself to the school board. And all the time people would say, hey, Rich, to me, how's the city council? I said, well, actually, I'm on the school board. And he would get the same thing. And so they never took the time to get to know me. And so that's another piece is do you really know? When I do these activities with leaders, ask them to go through everyone who reports to you. Write down one personal thing you know about them, personal. So it's not work related at all. It's how many children do they have, where they like to go camping, foods they like, something personal. And one thing that you value about what they bring to the workplace. Some leaders can go through and hit every one of them. Some barely get through half. So if you don't know your people, then how do you create that culture that says you're valued or that I see you? Because I think that's what people are looking for. It's really, I think, time to humanize ourselves or rehumanize ourselves from this division that we've been all caught up in. I think that that's part of this. So here's another one. My boss is crazy or hysterical. In general, what gender is this typically associated with? In general, it's typically associated with women. And so the idea of this, it goes to the angry Black woman as well. And there's another one that women have. I won't say the word, but it starts with a V and it ends with face. And it's all of these interpretations of how we see each other impact our interactions with each other. And so what this really is about is thinking about how you see each other. So instead of that, you could understand your colleague's viewpoint rather than ascribing her actions illogical. If you still don't agree, you could say, I don't understand her. Or somebody who has a disability, the way you've overcome your disability is so inspiring. What to do instead? Say nothing. And so it's really thinking about, as you look at workplace culture, what is it that would inspire somebody to want to stay and be a part of that? So the place that it begins is this idea of daily practices. So a daily practice is just something that you can do for a few minutes at a time with hyper-awareness. The hyper-awareness is really important. And so when people say, well, what should I do? A lot of times, I mean, what should I do about my company or about the culture or about something else? And it all starts with our own self. And so the first thing to do is to do daily practices with that increase your self-awareness. And so again, a daily practice is something like what I have shared there. Think about really being aware of your judgments and your stereotypes for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes. and just track how many times you judge or stereotype someone as you go out into the world. And those are those things where I just look at somebody and I go, oh, they're that, or they must be up to that, or I go through a process of thinking about or making an assumption about them without knowing anything that's happening. And it's really helpful to journal because then you can just read them and see them and have them in front of you, and something changes when it goes from our head to a pencil and we write it down. And so as you do that, and you do that outside of judging or blaming or shaming yourself, there's a story behind every one of those judgments and stereotypes. There's an experience that you had, there was a narrative that somebody gave you. And so the idea of increasing self-awareness is to just do some practices like that. And then as you transfer that into your workplace, think about it from that same lens of, if I were to ask the people who work for me, what are the assumptions or judgments or stereotypes that you experience in our workplace? What would they tell me? And so that's really the first place. We always want to start with let's do something versus let's figure out what it is that we're solving for, because every approach, the approaches to this work are going to be different based on your culture as it currently sits. And so there's another tool called the Global Diversity Inclusion Benchmarks. And it's a tool that has 14 assessments in it that you could do for pre and post to really start to look at where do your folks see the culture of the organization. And it's pretty comprehensive. And Patrick Lencioni has a test that looks at the 5 dysfunctions: trust, conflict, accountability, awareness to results, and attention to results. And there's a lot of ways to assess your workplace culture, but I think that's really the first step, is to see where you're starting. And it's true if we're working in a community or any other organization, is to really become more aware of my judgments. And even if I think somebody deserves it, that's that victim mentality. And so as we think about the workplace, it's really understanding what people are going to be bringing back into your workspaces as they come in. And some of them will be afraid, some of them will be rip-roaring and ready to go. And then you'll have folks all in the middle who will not be sure if they're going to be safe, however that looks to them. And they may spend a lot of their time in that place versus even being focused on what's happening at work. So Liz, are there any questions or comments or?
I am not seeing any questions in the chat yet, but go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I think one of the places where we also learn stereotypes is from our media, from the movies and the television and everything else that's out there right now.
So if you have a question or a thought, please put it in the chat. So if you're an employer, if you're a leader, this is the next steps: to have a conversation with those you lead. Ask about, do they feel valued? Are you ever treated in a way at work that is demeaning or denigrating? What is the treatment from public or from colleagues? And what needs to be shifted? And I think we also need to add to that, these questions, is what's working? What are the ways that you have felt valued? What are the ways that you have felt included? And not just operating from the premise that we are having everything done wrong, that we're not inclusive, but even balancing that. And I apologize, I didn't put those questions in here, but I think it's really important to think about what's working and how do we accelerate that, and then how do we support that to be able to break down some of those barriers. And when we're doing strategic planning, to really think about, how am I planning for these kinds of conversations or these kinds of relational pieces that are really important for people to be able to go through. And so remember, it's about practice, it's not about perfection, and that there are opportunities every day that folks come together to be able to have these conversations with each other.
And Bill, I do have a question to interject in here. It's
Great.
on how to speak to immigration clients. This is an immigration attorney regarding English skills, because not always sure, just a moment. Not sure. Well, I think just go ahead with the English skills, and then we have a couple more questions after that. So how do you ask someone?
About their skills in English?
Or more how they're understanding what you're telling them, because you don't know how good their English is.
I would talk to them and ask them questions and just start to have a conversation with them and to see if it's them who's not articulating or me that's just not hearing. And if it is a different language than mine, I will just say, I don't speak that language, but hang on and let me see how I can, if I can find somebody that can help me, because I only know English and I don't understand other languages. And sometimes people will start to talk to me in their native language, assuming that I'm some background, and I have to tell them to stop, that I don't understand, but I want to talk to them. So I think it just goes back to asking questions and not making assumptions about what's happening there. Being really inquisitive has always helped me. And not questions like, where are you from, but how can we have a conversation together? And how do I find somebody, if that's really important to me, that'll be a cultural mediator or an interpreter for me?
All right. Oh, good question. What experience have you had with ageism?
Well, people are asking me if I want the employee discount more and more often. Not sure if that's what you mean. I think ageism is very real. The way that we treat our elders is, I don't know what to say. It's just appalling on some levels. And think that you get to a certain point and you're not valued anymore, or you don't know anymore. And I say it from the lens of having a mom and a mother-in-law, mom who died from Alzheimer's and dementia, and mother-in-law who's going through that, knowing, that it's not the case for everyone that we all age gracefully, although that is a grace that I'm seeing in my mother-in-law, is that we can't keep looking at each other through this lens of what we see and then making up stories. I think that's the worst part of what we're doing. That's what created this whole piece around, let's talk about insults and dismissals. That's what I'm going to call them as we leave, rather than microaggressions, because that's what they are. They're insults and dismissals, and they don't feel good to anyone. And so I think the point of any of these isms is that we have a choice whether we want to see each other. I can see age. I can see somebody's older than me or younger than me. I might even guess they're the same age. I just won't use that as a predictor for how I'm going to treat them. See, it's not that we can't see race. We just can't use it as a predictor for how we treat people based on our own stereotypes and assumptions. And I think that's the challenge with all the isms. That was a great question.
Well, and I think we can't even tell how old people are anymore. It's hard to tell people's age from youth to geriatric anymore.
People ask me, how old do you think I am? And I just say to 24 to everyone. I found that to be a safe answer.
That's your safe answer.
Yes.
Okay, we have a question. Is there a link to the global D&I benchmarks?
Yeah, it's called GDIB. They're called the Global Diversity Inclusion Benchmarks. And if you just type that into your browser, it will pull right up. It is a document that I helped a little bit on, but the majority of it was written by 90 DEI experts around the world from all different levels of industry and business and nonprofit. And they spent a number of years looking at what are the characteristics or qualities that we can measure with this DEI work. So they created that one, which has 14 different assessments. And then there's also another one that was rewritten for an academic culture. And so there's a process you go through. I think the biggest challenge is interpreting the results. What's the information we're getting, and what's the work we need to do? Because if you use it properly, you use it as a pre-assessment, and then you spend 3 to 6 months implementing your strategy. And then at the end of that 3 to 6 months, then you take a post-assessment to see, have you seen any growth? So the other part with this work is you want to measure it more frequently because it shows that you're committed to it. And it also allows you to make changes to the culture as you go versus let's do this for a whole year and realize that you could have done some of this 6 or 8 months ago. And it's important to engage your employees. People that work on your behalf should be a part of this conversation.
Great, thank you. And then we had one more comment. From Lillian. I can put that link in there, Lillian. I'll do that in just a moment. We have a English speaker who speaks fluent Spanish, who says she compliments people on their English skills because they start out with no English and they're improving, and always encouraging them to take English classes. Is there anything else she should be doing in this? Is this helpful, or?
To say that I think if she's in an environment of teaching and modeling and coaching. So absolutely, that's not, I don't see that as a way that they're putting down the person, but just encouraging them. If I heard you right, it was more of an encouragement for somebody for getting further in the skill that they're learning. Is that right? Yeah.
That's, yeah.
I
Very
think that your biggest indicator is how you feel. Like if you say something and you get a knot in your stomach or you get emotionally charged, or it's probably something to think about. And so the process of deconstructing these parts that aren't as effective as we want them to be is not to completely get rid of them. It's just to understand the impact that they're having on your relationships. And so when we're talking about what needs to be shifted, it's just really thinking about this from an organizational perspective. And it's really challenging, I think, in business today, because we're so driven to that bottom line of the return on investment. And I don't know if this work has been done to the diligence to be able to show return on investment, because we're really investing in people. And so this industry a few years ago was a $10 billion industry, the DEI and equity. I think it's probably 2 or 3 times that today. And you would think that we're spending that much money that we would start to see results. And we're not really seeing them, or people aren't sharing them. If they're out there, I'd love to hear them. I don't know if we're seeing them from big organizational culture. And so the one thing I think about, so if it's not about this money and programs, then it must be about people. So what would happen if we invested all that money into the people in our organizations? Because it's still budgeted, we're still spending it. How do we turn it into something that actually inspires the people who are part of the organization to really want to do something? And it's challenging because leadership sets the standard. And so leaders have to be able to really look at themselves and say, what's the standard that I'm setting, and who's being impacted by this particular process, this decision that we're making. And I think that really is going to be the challenge as we move into this time now we're calling post-COVID. I don't know if we ever get out of the feelings of these things, we just rename them.
Bill, well, let me ask you one last question.
Okay.
If you were to advise us how to reach the business owners, the employers in Westland, Lake Oswego, or throughout Clackamas County, to help them to do more conversation and create more relationships, if you were able to wave a magic wand, what would you do to enhance this, to promote it to our business employers?
Well, Liz, I have these crazy ideas that people ask me once in a while about. So honestly, I'd put everybody in a room and I'd say, let's just sit around the table, or let's just sit in a big circle and let's talk about what it is that's getting in our way, or what it is that we like about each other. I think that's truly what's missing, is just the ability to sit with each other, because what I've found in doing my own work and this work professionally for so long is there is so much more that connects us than divides us. And we're stuck on all of these labels, and we're stuck on all of these assumptions, and then they turn into insults, and then they turn into people feeling dismissed. And when I think about that, I think about, well, I can either focus on that, or I can focus on what I think would deconstruct it, which is having a sense of belonging and inclusion. Belonging is just personal. It really basically says that I can be a part of this organizational culture without having to give up a part of myself to do so. Inclusion is that I feel valued, that the system, the organization, whatever you want to call it, values what I bring both personally and professionally. And I think that's the work as we move into this new work world, because just because COVID's over doesn't mean everybody's going to go right back to their cars and workspaces, because there's a transition that's happening here. And if we miss the transition, or we go too fast through it, or we got to get our return on investment, then we're just going to perpetuate the same outcomes that we're receiving. So I'm going to end by just saying I'm really encouraged by what you both are doing with your collaborating chambers and this group of 7 that you've put together in Clackamas County. And I will just say, keep doing that, because that really is the work. The only solution for where we are is to be able to sit in dialogue with each other and to realize that there's more that connects us than divides us. And it feeds my soul, because my why for this is to make the world a more humane place. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you all who are out there that I can't see. It's been a pleasure to sit with you for a little while, and I'll turn it back to Liz.
And I would like to thank everybody for coming today. We will send you all a link to today's presentation. We'll send Bill a list of the people who came today. Would like to thank Shatrine Craig from the Westland Chamber of Commerce, and thank Pamplin Media for the advertising that they helped with us. And most of all, we'll be looking at more programs like this. But I think, as Bill says, and what we say in all of our leadership Lake Oswego classes, is it's all about relationships. And we are relationship communities in both Westland and Lake Oswego. And Bill, thank you so much for putting this presentation on today.
You're
And thanks.
welcome. I appreciate it. Have a great
All
day,
right.
everybody.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. I am going to end it now. Let's, there we go.